Hello, welcome back. My name is Dr. Christopher Gennari, and this is Great Big History Podcast. And in this episode, we do part 2 of Vietnam in the 19th, early 20th century. In this episode, the French arrive. Imperialism, colonization, and the loss of independence. The French conquer southern Vietnam in 1858, or begin in 1858, and by the end of the next decade, by 1867, they've effectively conquered what used to be the Sham lands that the Nguyen dynasty had only recently conquered about a century before. And the idea was the French needed an excuse, and that excuse was to support the Christian minority. We talked about in the last episode that successors to Gia Long had begun to persecute Christians, kick out French missionaries, Catholic missionaries, and in general try to close Vietnam up. Well, the French weren't going to let that happen. They didn't have any other colonies in Asia. They had been kicked out of India by the British. The Dutch were entrenched in Indonesia. The British were in Malaysia and Hong Kong and dominating the trade routes to China. Japan was closed off or had just gotten visited by the Americans. Spain had the Philippines, and China still had control over Korea. And though there was some French missionary and some French contact with Korea, it's much farther away. It's on the other side of China. And there's no other ports. And so Vietnam was Catholic because of the Portuguese, especially South Vietnam. The Portuguese had kind of failed as an empire. By 1858, they had been replaced by Britain and France. And so it was a logical place. And they were allies to Gia Long. So they had a contact. So the idea of being kicked out was, hey, we belong here. Now, having conquered the old Sham territories of what are southern Vietnam, now the French had to protect that. And so, like the Roman Republic and its wars, you start doing what they would call defensive wars, but conquering out from the hub. And so into Cambodia, into southern Vietnam proper, the old Nguyen dynasty territory in the 1870s, 1880s, to protect it, to protect Cambodia, to protect the French lands from the Thai armies in Cambodia, and then to protect their lands from the North Vietnamese. And then you have to expand into Laos to protect North Vietnam itself from the Thais. And you see, each time you conquer something, you need to conquer another thing to protect the thing you just conquered. That's how imperialism works. In the end, French Indochina, as it was called, ruled over 30 million people, of which only 34,000 were French. French settlers, mostly on rubber plantations. They came to kind of get rich, and rubber was the main export. They came as government officials to run the colony for France. They came as merchants, as middlemen, to sell European goods, French goods, to the Vietnamese, the Laotians, the Cambodians. They came as teachers, missionaries. So 34 in a 3 different countries, maybe 20 plus, probably many more ethnic groups, major ethnic groups. You have 34,000 settlers. And, not many military. So you can see you can't run this if you're the French. 34,000 people, 34,000 Frenchmen cannot in any way run 30 million people without the 30 million people being at least ambivalent about it, if not okay with it. And so the French are perfectly willing, as the British are in India, to hire elites, to bring elites in order to keep or gain your positions. And so elites learn French, become Catholic, join the French government, because they'll be treated well, because the French need them. They get to be in power, and the French need them. And the French are also willing, perfectly willing, to bring in, at least for these elites, the benefits of French civilization. Education in Paris, the Sorbonne, French technology, railroads, motor cars. Once we get into the 19th and 20th century, the French needed elites. And so elites said, well, I'll work with you. But there's also, because Vietnam is Vietnam with its history, the French are seen as the new Chinese. They're an occupier, to be resisted, to be endured. If you just wait long enough, it's very Buddhist, if you wait long enough, they'll go away. Now, that doesn't mean being passive either. But they're to be resisted. They're the new Chinese. We kicked out the Chinese, who are here, who are over the mountains. We kicked out the Han, right? The Taishun defeated a Han army, a Qing army. All right, so we can do this. The French are no different than the Chinese. We can resist them. Now that is important. Star that, bold that, underline that, because that is a national sentiment that we are going to see in part 3 of our course when the Americans arrive. When the French get kicked out by the Vietnamese and then the Americans come in to replace them. The idea that the Americans, the French, are just the new Chinese, the new Thai. Another outsider who wants to occupy Vietnam. What happens to the Vietnamese economy? Well, now it changes. As the French dominate the government, and especially dominate the government in order to dominate the economy becomes export-driven to fuel French industrialization. Trade doesn't dry up with Thailand or China, but gets redirected to France, which had been very tiny, and now it's going to be the largest export for Vietnam. So Vietnam went from trading very little with France to now it's its largest export partner, which means infrastructure has to be built to support those exports. You need to build roads from the plantations to bring in the rubber. You have to build factories. You have to build warehouses. You have to build ports. You have to build cities in order to house the workers, to move all this stuff, to build the barrels, to build the boxes, to build the shipping containers, to build the ships. You need railroads. There's mining in the mountains on the Laotian border or in North Vietnam on the border with China. Well, that now has to be exported to France, so you need to build railroads through the jungle, through the mountains. You also import stuff, not necessarily stuff the Vietnamese need. The biggest one is going to be opium. Again, the French are able to get the opium from Afghanistan, from Pakistan, from British merchants, and then transport it to Vietnam, China, where the open door policy will allow the French to do trade in China. So they're drug pushers as well. But the big export will be rubber. Taken out of the trees, the sap of the trees, is then turned into rubber, turned into tires, turned into bands, turned into industrialized products. Vietnam became, despite being the second largest empire in the world, especially dominating large parts of Africa, Vietnam would become France's second biggest colonial investment after Algeria for France. Algeria was so big, it became basically the 51st state. It became part of France. It was a province of France. The way Americans think of Hawaii or Alaska. It's not attached, but it is. It's just part of us. That's the way the French thought about Algeria. Vietnam was not far behind that, which means the French can't let it go. It's too important. Having lost Haiti and Santo Domingo in 1804 as their largest colonial market, producer, profit center, now they've replaced it with Algeria, which had 2 million or so French settlers on the coast, and then Vietnam. So they can't let it go. And that's going to be important in part 3, when after World War II, the French return. Having been kicked out twice, they'll return. Well, so that is the Vietnamese situation. The French situation. How does the Vietnamese feel about it? Well, as we talked about, the French are the new Chinese. So Vietnamese independence movements begin almost immediately. One of the most important is the Cao Dai. Caodai. And this is, again, a Tong Hak religious movement. It's a peasant movement that we see in China. We see it's not directly connected. It's the like. It's a peasant movement that takes in lots of ideological strains. It's got a little bit of Christianity in it. It's got a little bit of Western philosophy in it, democracy and independence and freedom. It's got Confucianism. It's got Buddhism. It has peasant religions. It's got folk art and folk cultures in it. And so it mixes all of these things. So even though I call it Tong Hak, it's because Korea goes first in this class. And so the idea of it is that you're seeing these peasant, the peasants are trying to figure out how to deal with all of the different cultural strains that they're dealing with. The traditional Confucian and Buddhism, and the new stuff of enlightenment, liberal enlightenment, Western enlightenment, and Christianity. How do you live in a world with all of those if they don't necessarily agree with each other? And so that's what this is. It's kind of a mixture of all these different philosophies. So it's a combination of many of these different Viet kin traditions, which makes it very Vietnamese. It makes it an independence movement. It's we believe this. The French don't believe this. The Chinese don't believe it. But there's also more pure Western philosophies as well. And this is the educated class. These are the people who will study in French schools, or if they're wealthy enough, in France itself. And in this comes the particular French Revolution ideology. It's kind of like whenever Americans show up, we bring our Declaration of Independence with us. The French bring the French Revolution. And so you got the very notion of liberté, égalité, and fraternité, the liberty, equality, and brotherhood. Well, that sounds great. So if you're Vietnamese, you go, well, we want that. And here comes French racism, right? But you get Rousseau and Montesquieu and the American Revolution and the French rights of man. And you get all these ideas that people are equal and they should have a freedom and they should have the right to determine self-determination. And you go, okay, give that to us. And the French go, yeah, you're not ready for it yet. Like, why? We have a 5,000-year-old culture. And they're like, yeah, but you're not. How does one say it? You know, white. And that's the racism. And the economics justified it. The economics justified the racism. And then an American comes in and steps into this. And we're going to have, and when we do decolonization, you'll see, you've seen this. Wilson's 14 points steps into it. In trying to end the war, or at least justify a peaceful method of ending the war, the First World War, Wilson comes up with his 14 points. The most important of which, to non-Europeans, or even to Europeans, I gotta say, no, I'll take that back. Even to most Europeans, was the idea of self-determination, that peoples should be able to run their own countries, that a country should be based on an ethnic group. The French should get France, the English should get England, the Irish should get Irish, the Poles and the big argument was the Poles, because Poland was dominated by Russia. The territory that was Poland had been divvied up between Austria-Hungary, Germany, and Russia. And there's a lot of Poles who live in the United States and vote, especially in the Midwest. And so, Poland should be the land. Poles should get a Poland. There is even the idea, now Wilson, I don't know Wilson's feelings on it, but in England, there was the idea of support for a land for the Jews. The Balfour Declaration, the Jew, even the Jews should get their own land. This idea of self-determination. Well, if you're Vietnamese and you hear this, this is it. This is Wilson's your man. And Wilson was incredibly popular. He might be, to Barack Obama, maybe Reagan, the most, no, probably FDR, right? I'm working it out. But he was incredibly popular. When he showed up, it was in lots of ways as the man who would bring peace, to end the war, to end all wars. Now, it turned out the Treaty of Versailles was not based on the 14 points, and that's going to be one of many causes of World War II. But Wilson's idea of self-determination was seen as a way of solving the problem of empires. The problem was non-white peoples, non-Europeans heard that message too and said, that applies to us. And the Europeans, and to a lesser extent Americans, didn't necessarily think so. But hearing this, there is a Vietnamese nationalist living in Paris at the time, Nguyen Shen Kun, who takes it seriously. Now, this man is going to eventually take on another nom de guerre known as Ho Chi Minh. The founder, and there's a blue history sticker at where the Carlton Hotel once stood, which was Ho Chi Minh, founder of modern Vietnam, worked in London at the Carlton Hotel. He will be in London, he'll be in Paris. So he goes to the peace conference to petition Wilson, to find Wilson as a fanboy. He's a fanboy of Wilson. And to be like, tell the French to free Vietnam and we will be such a great ally. You want us, we'll trade with you. And Western racism kicks him out. He never meets with Wilson, which makes sense. He's not a somebody. He's a nobody. And then he's a Asian nobody. So, but there are Asian and African somebodies, kings, like real people who are showing up at Versailles who are not getting anything either. So, but this is one of those moments in history where you look back and go, what if? What if Wilson wasn't so racist? What if the Europeans weren't so racist? What if they met with Nguyen Shen Kun? Does he become Ho Chi Minh? And does that lead to the American involvement in Vietnam? Or is Vietnam a democratic ally of the United States back in the 1930s? Is American history different? And I don't know. But I'm a Gen Xer. And I've grown up in an America traumatized by the Vietnam War, which we'll talk about in part 3. Traumatized. Whether it's the Rambo movies, the Platoon, Apocalypse Now, Coming Home, the movies of the 70s, Deer Hunter, whether it's going to the Vietnam Memorial Wall, whether it's listening to Born in the USA, which my boomer parents and their friends and family took as a glorious patriotic song, when the lyrics literally say being sent to Vietnam to go and kill the yellow man. I mean, it's not a patriotic song. It's a terrible song about post-Vietnam trauma that we are still living with. Those of you who are older millennials, those of you who are Gen Zers, like, you're still living in the world of boomer trauma. The 60s, the music of the 60s, the movies of the 60s. Your parents, your grandparents, whether they went to the war, marched against the war, ignored the war, they were traumatized by it. And the question is, could that have been avoided in 1917 by Woodrow Wilson being a little less racist? I don't know. Well, Ho Chi Minh doesn't stop. He's a nationalist. He wants to free Vietnam. And he's involved in the groups to do it. And he eventually ends up in the USSR. And the USSR is Russia post-communist revolution. So the communist revolution begins in 1917. And the USSR is the successor state to that. Lenin wins the Civil War. He'll die in 1924, but Lenin knows he needs help. And as a communist, as a guy who wants to destroy the capitalist industrial system, he knows he's going to get no help from Brits, French, Germans, and Americans, governments. Maybe individuals, maybe intellectuals, maybe leftists, but not the governments themselves. And so he needs help. So where can he go? Who can he get for help? Well, why not bring in the individuals, especially in Africa, in Asia, India, China, Southeast Asia, who are looking for a way of getting rid of the British, the French, the Germans. You know, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, kind of thing. And so Ho Chi Minh goes to the USSR, goes to Moscow, where he'll learn Marxism, but more importantly, will make contacts with other communist revolutionaries, both in the Soviet Union and in East Asia. He'll be sent to go work with the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, where he'll learn guerrilla warfare from Mao, organizational principles from the Chinese Communist Party. He'll get contacts and get technology, propaganda technology, and later military technology from the Soviet Union. They begin constructing party infrastructure for independence with the USSR's help, with the Soviet Union's help. Meanwhile, the Europeans are becoming focused on Europe. There's the trauma of World War I, known as the Lost Generation. There's the pleasures of the 1920s, the Jazz Age. Hey, we're not dead. We're going to listen to Black African-American music, jazz. We're going to drink. And if it's made illegal in America, we're still going to drink. And rich Americans can go to France and go to Britain and live well because the dollar was strong. And then there's going to be the trauma at the end of the 20s and the early 30s of the Great Depression. Meanwhile, exploitation of Vietnam is going to continue, but without much direction or power. It's a boat whose engines have been cut. The French need money. As long as Vietnam can export rubber and resources that can be produce money, fine. Whatever. So what you have is a very localized system where plantation owners treat their Vietnamese helpers badly. They live like French lords. Because if you're French and you're going to move to Vietnam, why wouldn't you live like a lord? Why would you be a peasant? And so you live like a French lord. Local government, local French leaders can do what they want, and they give a lot of leeway to Vietnamese allies to do what they want. Which means the French don't have a good reputation. They're not readying Vietnam for independence. So that even if you don't have a bad experience with the French, you're not having good experiences with them either. Unless you're tied into the French cultural/trade network. French missionary schools, French education, French trade in Saigon. You know, if you're tied into that, then hey, the French are making you money. And they're not asking all of that much. You just had to pretend that you just had to agree to pretend the French were in charge. And as long as you didn't cause trouble, you could get along with your life. Most Vietnamese never met a French person. The French were overwhelmingly in the far south. So if you're in the far north, you might never meet a white person. And so the exploitation continues because the French have too much military power to revolt. But the French aren't interested in it, in the empire. They're interested in France, in rebuilding France after the First World War. And so that's where we are. We have dedicated nationalists, of which the most famous will be Ho Chi Minh. But he's not the only one. And they're working with nationalists in other countries, especially the communists are working together across other countries because communism is an international system. And they're striving. There's also secular, there's also democratic nationalists working within the system as well. You're going to imagine what happens to those people later on. They're going to lose. The French leave. Then they're going to pick America, the United States, and then the United States is going to leave after 20 years. And a lot of those people are going to get shot. They're going to have to flee Vietnam. So, but that's part 3 of our course. That's where we will end. With the Great Depression coming, Europe and France more concerned with what's going on in Europe than in helping the Vietnamese people improve their lives. With dedicated nationalists, with the rhetoric that the French are just the new Chinese, the new occupying enemy. We can kick them out just like we kicked the Chinese out. And with a strong Vietnamese identity being created in this. And so that's where we will end. Thank you very much. Be safe. Take care. Stay healthy.